Welcome to Ordinary Rebels. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. Let's bring the panel up and get going. Do you guys want to come up? So we are calling this Ordinary Rebels. Ordinary meaning everyday, typical, average. Rebel meaning stir things up, make enemies, make a statement, go against the wind. It's kind of a contradiction in terms, and I think it's a good unifying principle for these three nonfiction books, which all explore really remarkable lives in World War II. My name is Ilya Marritz. I live here in Narrowsburg. I'm married to the festival, as a lot of you know, which is Aaron Hicklin. And I'm a journalist myself. I've worked with ProPublica and PR at the Boston Globe, a bunch of places. And this panel is special to me because I grew up hearing about World War II from the lives of people who lived it on the inside. In the case of my family in occupied Prague, later when I lived in Germany in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was totally routine to meet an older person who might have been in the Hitler Youth or might have, almost starved to death at the end of the war because of the shortage of food. And that generation is dying out, but there are a few of those people left, and I think it's really important that we continue to explore those times. So I said I wasn't going to do a lot of talking, and I'm doing a lot of talking. Let's introduce the amazing panel. Starting on the far end, Peter Pomerantsev, Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Is that still correct? Okay, good. I'm just pulling from something I saw online. Figured me out. His books include Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, about his adventures making reality TV in Russia at the turn of the millennium. It's amazing. It's here for sale. But the one that we're going to talk about here is How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler, also for sale here. Next, we have Suzanne Cope. She's a professor at NYU. I would say her specialty is shining a light on the role of women in really hairy situations. You've written about women in the Black Panther Party. Women of War is the book we're going to be discussing here. The Italian assassins, spies, and couriers who fought the Nazis, also for sale. And lastly, Rebecca Donner, the author of All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, the true story of an American woman at the heart of the German resistance to Hitler. She's received a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, a bunch of other amazing honors, and she's completing a new book about the Scholl siblings, who are very well known in Germany and very little known, I think, outside of it, and I think it's gonna really bring their story to a wider audience and revise how people who think they know the story think they know the story. So welcome, everyone. I asked you guys each to prepare a 2-minute thing just to get a taste of your writing. Can we move this way? Peter, if you want to go first.
So this is not my writing. So my book is about, as we'll explore, about a British operation to subvert Nazi propaganda. And so I'm just going to read a little bit about the kind of broadcasts that the British were doing in order to really sort of subvert Hitler's hold over mainstream Germans. So I won't do it in German, if that's okay, I'll do it in English. So the archive has survived. It's at College Park. I spent quite a lot of time at College Park, the US National Archives, going through these transcripts. Take the case of Tienemann, who has been lecturing women in the Visa area to keep away from foreign workmen, when Tienemann has a Polish lover at home who is personally in charge of the bamboo canes, twigs, thin and thick leather straps and cat-o'-nine tails with which Tienemann and his guests are straightening her fat and large buttocks. All of them gather in the air shelter with the district leader crapper constructed for himself. Mind, there are no bombs in this part of the country, but the air raid shelter prevents people outside from hearing the yells of Wanda when the leather cuts deep into her skin. Tienemann's chauffeur takes her on his back and holds her strongly. The SS swine loves it when the naked woman's body whimpers back, cries and yells under the blows, and swears with the vilest words in the Polish language. And when she's properly whipped up to a purple color and whimpers and cries from pain, then the old impotent testicles are ready, and Wanda's straight thighs enclose the thighs of the chauffeur, and he can feel every push of his lord and master until Wanda bites his arm. Are my kids here? I've got 2 15-year-olds. It's awkward. Are you guys here? Yeah? Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. So that's not me. That is top level British counter propaganda.
That was broadcast on the radio.
Oh yeah.
We're going to talk more about that. Suzanne.
So this book is about 4 women who are telling the broader story, and this section is from one of Carla's section, and she is right there. And it's from about halfway through the book. Yeah, briefly, context is Carla and some other resistance women came to this, they came to this other protest to help support the women who were trying to get information about some of the men that were stolen from the streets by the Nazis. This effort was stalled when the crowd of women began chanting, "Teresa, Teresa," as they parted to allow a very pregnant woman to make her way towards the front to deliver a package to one of the many men at the barred windows. The crowd grew silent as Teresa Golace, with one of her 5 young children following close behind, broke into a run through an opening in the police barricade, her son holding on to the hem of her dress. She threw her parcel of food towards the windows, her husband and his fellow prisoners leaning down to try to catch it, but it fell short. She grabbed the package to try again when a German officer on a motorcycle pulled up. Carla was near the front of the crowd, watching the scene from a few yards away. The women around her started shouting again, this time at the officer, demanding that he leave Teresa alone. The crowd surged towards the barricade, leaning on Carla, and she had trouble catching her breath as she watched the interaction play out in front of her, her hand clasped around the gun in her pocket. Carla watched the German grab Teresa, but the words they exchanged were lost in the cries of the crowd. Teresa freed herself, and the officer grabbed her again, nearly lifting her off the ground. Teresa's little boy bent to pick up the package, and Carla heard an explosion. The Nazi had drawn his gun and shot the woman dead. The crowd began to wail, and Carla, incensed and with no thought as to the repercussions, pulled her gun from her pocket and pointed it at the German. She was grabbed by fascist guardsmen who tried to disarm her, while women from the crowd attempted to pull her free. Rosa squeezed close to Carla and whispered, "Give me the gun." As the women pulled Carla in one direction and the guards in another, she was able to release the weapon into Rosa's waiting hand as she was tossed about in a roiling ocean of furious, grieving women. Carla was finally pulled from the crowd by the guards and forced to walk towards where Teresa's murder had taken place, past the small wailing child who still clutched the clothes of his dead mother. One guard kicked Carla to make her walk faster. "Let's kill her here," that guard said to the other. "No," he responded, "at the barracks."
And Rebecca.
I conceived of this book, All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, as a fusion of biography, espionage thriller, and scholarly detective story about my great-great-aunt, who is depicted right here. And I'm going to read the introduction. Her aim was self-erasure. The more invisible she was, the better her chances of survival. In her journal, she noted what she ate, read, thought. The first was uncontroversial. The second and third were not. For this reason, she hid the journal. When she suspected the Gestapo was closing in on her, she destroyed it, burned it, most likely. She was at the harrowing center of the German resistance, but she wasn't German, nor was she Polish or French. She was American, conspicuously so. The men she recruited acquired code names: Armless, Beamer, Worker. She operated under no code name. Still, she was elusive. The nature of her work required absolute secrecy. She didn't dare tell her family, who were scattered across the towns and dairy farms of the Midwest. They remained bewildered that she, at 26, had jumped aboard a steamer ship and crossed the Atlantic, leaving behind everyone she loved. Her family is my family. 3 generations separate us. She preferred anonymity, so I will whisper her name, Mildred Harnack. In 1932, she held her first clandestine meeting in her apartment, a small band of political activists that grew into the largest underground resistance group in Berlin by the end of the decade. During the Second World War, her group collaborated with a Soviet espionage network that conspired to defeat Hitler, employing agents and operatives in Paris, Geneva, Brussels, and Berlin. In the fall of 1942, the Gestapo pounced. She was thrown in prison. So were her co-conspirators. During a hastily convened trial at the Reichskriegsgericht, the Reich Court-Martial, a prosecutor who'd earned the moniker Hitler's Bloodhound hammered them with questions. She sat on a wooden chair in the back of the courtroom. Other chairs held high-ranking Nazi officers. At the center of the room sat a panel of 5 judges. Everyone there was German except her. When it was her turn, she approached the stand. She was emaciated, her lungs ravaged by tuberculosis she'd contracted in prison. How long she stood there remains unknown. Surviving documents don't note the time the prosecutor began questioning her or the time he stopped. What is known is this: the answers she gave him were lies, real whoppers. The judges believed her. The sentence she received was considered mild, 6 years of hard labor in a prison camp. 2 days later, Hitler overrode the verdict and ordered her execution. On February 16, 1943, she was strapped to a guillotine and beheaded.
Nobody ever knows whether to clap at these events. I was at a morning session and there was poetry, and it's like, do you clap for poetry? I mean, we love poetry, but do we clap for it? Often it's about really hard things. I want to start with you, Rebecca, because we've just been hearing about your great-great-aunt? Great-aunt?
Great-great. She
Great-great.
was my grandmother's aunt.
Did you grow up knowing that you were related to somebody like this?
When I was about 8, it was the first time that I encountered her name. I was visiting my great-grandmother, who was Mildred's sister, and she asked me to stand up against the wall and to take my height, and she put a pencil mark on the wall, and I stood back and I looked at all the other horizontal pencil marks, and some were very dark, like mine, and some were very faint, and one had an M next to it, a very faint M, and I pointed to it and I asked her, "Who's M?" And she said, "Mildred." But she didn't tell me anything more, but at that young age, I sensed so much conflict. I sensed love, I sensed rage, I sensed even bewilderment, and for me, the mystery of Mildred began right then. And then when I was 16, my grandmother told me more. So she knew I wanted to be a writer, and she gave me Mildred's letters and told me a little bit more about the story, including how she was executed and the acts of resistance that she participated in. And she told me that this was an epic story and asked me if I would write it one day, and I promised her I would. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
No,
Not
truly.
at all. Yeah.
So I want to get to this pathway in also with you, Suzanne and Peter. Maybe Peter first. You've been interested in propaganda. Propaganda runs through all of your books. The idea of like lies, how you spin truths, how you influence public opinion and perceptions. When did Sefton Delmer become a person for you, who you were interested in?
So because, also my studies at Hopkins, I'm doing sort of lots of social research about why do people believe terrible things and what we can do about it. So it's sort of inevitable that somebody would at one point say, have you heard about this largely forgotten story of a vast British operation to subvert Nazi propaganda? I mean, it was huge. It was sort of, it was covert propaganda, but Delmer was running sort of up to 20 radio stations, which were listened to by half of German soldiers among the top media inside Germany. Sort of completely forgotten story. Hundreds of people working in this beautiful estate outside of London, surrounded by old masters, working together with stars of the German cabaret scenes, Jews, theatrical Jews playing Nazis on these radio shows with these incredible porn scenes. I mean, why wouldn't I write it? Yeah, I mean, and then COVID happened, and I was like, okay, I have time to go through the archive, because it turns out doing history is really hard compared to journalism, because most of my stuff is contemporary. So COVID happened, and that gave me the time to burrow into the archive and do all that hard work. But the reason I started to write the book was that it turned out that Delmer's understanding of propaganda was actually what I'm interested in as well. I'm not actually very interested in disinformation. I don't actually have that much of a problem with politicians lying. I mean, I think they usually do that. Amazing when they tell the truth, I'd say. But I am fascinated by propaganda as a way to talk about freedom. When are you in control of who you are, and when are you being manipulated by others? Understanding identity. We had this previous session which was all about identity and the immigrant experience. Delmer was an immigrant, and he understood how media culture shaped people's identities. He saw the Nazis as a sort of almost grotesque cabaret act that were giving people someone to be in a time of tumultuous change. And those are the things that I was interested in. So I've always used propaganda as kind of way into other things. I'm not a communication scholar. I work with them, but I'm not one. So it's when I found this connection with Delmer, down to like little details of his life. He grew up in Germany, English, but living in Germany during World War I, seen as an Englishman in Germany, comes to England as a kid, is seen as German in England. And I had an echo of that experience. I was born in Kiev, grew up in England, where I was sort of like, seen as an outsider, kind of Soviet. Then I went to Russia and explored that. He went to Berlin. So all these echoes of being a kind of insider-outsider who can see, or thinks they can see, how propaganda shapes individuals. So that was the reason, but also like the archive, as you can tell, is just too delicious not to use, really.
It is delicious, but the tapes are gone.
Well,
or mostly gone.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't look. This was the Second World War, so just to be clear, I mean, a lot of the radio stations that Delmer created, they had the veneer of being Nazi stations. It gets very complicated because he wanted his audience to know that they were actually the Brits impersonating angry German soldiers or Nazi radio. So the audience was in on the game. It was a very complicated psychological trick that he was trying to pull off. But the guys at the State Department thought these were genuine Nazi stations. So they had to transcribe all Nazi radio. And you have these wonderful notes by some transcriber going, this station's kind of weird. It says it's Nazi, but it's kind of opposed to the Nazis, and it might be in France. This might be like a renegade station. We're not sure, and it's in England. Yeah, even though obviously sort of like the White House knew and the forerunner to the CIA knew, but the transcribers at the State Department didn't know. So a lot of the archive is here at College Park. There's rumors that there might be some recordings. There's a couple of recordings they made. Hilariously, they made one for the King of England. Kind of like, here is a selection of our covert, subversive propaganda for you to listen to, sir. Which that remains. So we have little snippets of what it sounded like. But part of the fun is that you read it now like a play, because we know what he wanted to achieve, and he had very distinct psychological aims. And we have the transcripts. So actually reading them, you start acting them out, and I try to do it here a little bit. A real actor would do it much better. So there is that space to imagine what they sounded like.
Suzanne, your book is different from the other two in that it has 4 heroes, kind of a quartet. Tell me what they have in common, and maybe tell me about one of them who really captivated you.
Sure. So I'm sure you guys can appreciate as we talk about the archives is that you can really only tell a story with what you can find in sources of what they've left behind. So part of what I wanted to do, apropos for this panel, is highlight what ordinary people were doing and tell the larger story of the resistance through these stories of 4 ordinary people. And so I found transcripts. 2 of them wrote memoirs. Many of them were 2 of them were in politics after the war, and so they left behind a lot of interviews. And so I really wanted to use their own words to recreate their lives during this time. I do love Carla because she left behind this wonderful memoir. It's all in Italian, and I studied Italian for a while, but I really became close to fluent reader, not speaker, because as you get older, these are very different skills I'm realizing, the speaking and the reading. And reading this memoir was wonderful because it was also kind of my journey of learning Italian better, because I would go back to it many times. And so I felt like I really got to know her. And even reading that section that I just read to you all, her feelings in that moment, she was able to record, and I'm able to share it with you all. And so her story is probably the most dramatic, and I mean, she was in a guerrilla warfare group in Rome, and she's hiding out, underground, and she takes part in one of the largest and most controversial bombings of the Italian resistance. But my heart is kind of with Anita, who is the least well known of these 4. And she was a farm girl turned, kind of waitress, and she became part of the resistance as a courier mostly, and then she was found out and had to escape to the mountains. And she was one of the first women to join the partisans in the mountains. And then she was such a badass because she really would, she learned how to, well, she didn't, women know how to flirt with the guys to get by the roadblocks, and she apparently was quite well endowed, and so she would hide things in her boobs, or she'd dress, right, ladies, dress for the job you want, and so she would dress provocatively, and would kind of, tease the guys to get by. And then she wrote, in her testimony, she's like, oh, and the stupid fools, they let me by. And so she was just so wonderful, and I just love her spunk. And so she ended up, from November 44 to the end of the war, she was in the mountains. And really she became she became leader of her own battalion up there, because she was so wonderful, of men and women. And so I think my heart kind of lies with her.
Uh-huh. And when you look at these 4 stories side by side, we're thinking about ordinary lives trying to make a significant difference, taking great personal risks. How were these women changed by what they did? What was the before and after?
Oh, they were radically changed. First of all, thinking about Italians under fascism, these women were all almost pretty much fascism in Italy started when they were young. So they only really knew life under Mussolini. And part of this, as many people here know, fascists like to control what is taught in schools, what you're allowed to talk about, what's in the press. And so they didn't really have a sense of political agency or of options, or what their government could look like for the most part. And so they very quickly felt compelled to do something when the Nazis occupied Italy. And so they had to learn very quickly what that something might be. And I think, not too long ago myself, I was thinking, oh my God, we're in a moment here in 2025. What do I do? I don't know what to do. And I'm like, wait a second, I wrote a freaking book about this. What did these people do? They started something from nothing. And I know y'all can feel the same way. And so they had to start with political education, and then they had to connect with other people, and it really, watching those steps and seeing it, move step by step. And what they also found, besides their political agency, they all became feminists. Many women, including women I didn't write about in this book, were saying this is the time I felt most free, because it was very patriarchal, trad wife situation happening under fascism, and they truly felt free to be themselves. They could go places. They had to spend the night not in their own homes. Oh my God, with men, and a lot of them. The women in this book included, fell in love with people that they met. And so it was this moment of real transformation for them on a personal and political level.
So their lessons for today would be what? Get organized?
Yes,
be bold,
political
learn things?
Education, connect with others, specialize. Don't feel like you have to do everything. Like, think about what you can do and what your people, that you're connecting are doing. Definitely, I think more broadly, the fact that, and I'm thinking about, I'm formulating like an article in my head about this because it just kind of occurred to me. The provisional Italian government, really, it was 5 distinct, parties that came together and said, we have to prove to the Allies that we can govern our own country. And they also were the ones who pretty much were in charge of the resistance, broadly, simply. And so they really worked together because they had this very clear goal of, we do not want to be occupied by the Allies, hopefully should the Allies win. And so this idea of working together and finding and having a clear goal that we could figure out our part in this. And then also the fact that there are so many, these stories of women on the front line and also men, but they had to have so much support system behind them. So even doing something small, like knitting socks or donating a few lira were really powerful because there's a statistic I quote at the end that there were 15 support people for every person on the front line. And they were absolutely essential because, this is a homegrown army fighting a very much better resourced Nazi army, and so they needed them.
I have sort of a version of the same question for you, Peter, and this has to do with Sefton Delmer's kind of fundamental insight, which I don't know how you would put it, but it seemed to me like it was like, think a lot more creatively about how to get inside your enemy's head than you are presently doing. And I wonder if anybody's doing that very well right now. Like, is anybody taking Sefton Delmer's lessons?
Well, look, they're dangerous lessons, and the book sees both the sort of advantages and disadvantages of his approach. So he's not, I don't deify him at all. Look, Delmer is a very contemporary character. He was very frustrated with what we would call liberal media today. He was very frustrated with German kind of social democrat opposition media, with the BBC German service, who they thought were just doing these kind of noble lectures about how democracy dies in darkness, how fascism is evil, and you should choose the bright path of liberalism. And he was like, look, it's 1941. Hitler occupies Europe from like the Atlantic de facto to the Black Sea. Either people like Hitler, or they've left, or they're too scared to do anything. You're not going to break through with this sort of like moralizing. You've got to understand the emotional connection people have with Nazi propaganda, and you have to subvert it. And he kind of thought it rested on 3 pillars. One, kind of identification with the leader in the sense that, we often wonder why leaders who are narcissistic, sadistic, hysterical are popular. And Delmer said, because they're like that. And secretly, many people want to be that. And Hitler is allowing people to be the worst of themselves. He had a very bleak view of human nature, but maybe a correct one. And then sort of group identity. So Germans were very confused. The Nazis gave them a group identity. And most curiously, a kind of a role to act in life. The Nazis gave you a language, a uniform to wear, a way to structure your emotions, your sex drives, all these kind of things, so you could act Nazi, essentially. And he tried to undermine all of those. So he tried to break the Nazi monopoly on sexual frustration, on anger. He created alternative group identities, stressing the community of the army, of the church, the regions in Germany. And most importantly, he would think about how do you get people to act for themselves? How do you provoke people to act in ways that was in their interest and not the Nazis? So for him it meant, giving people instructions on how they could feign an illness to run away from the front, or many other roles that you could play that would take you out of the Nazi cabaret. If he was alive today, he would love social media, because he definitely saw propaganda, effective propaganda, as being about getting people involved in things, and how would you get them involved in something else? So he would love social media. He would be very attuned. I think he probably would be using pornography like he did then. He'd be thinking about those sort of very elemental desires. And he would be thinking about how you create group identities. But your question was different. Is anybody doing that? No, is the answer. Not at scale. There's probably boutique little things happening. The Ukrainians are doing a bit of that to get Russian soldiers to defect. But that kind of vision of like, how do you actually penetrate into the echo chamber of an authoritarian propaganda. I don't see that being done at scale, and it'd be bad if there was something huge, because I'm meant to be an expert.
I mean, nobody can know everything. Rebecca, the thing that's extraordinary about your book, and I've really never read any book like it, is just how immediate it feels and how close by the end of this book I felt to Mildred, in spite of the fact that she burned her journals. The evidence of her life is real, but it's really fragmentary, and you point to a lot of the fragments. So you're doing history differently, and I can't quite put it into words, but maybe you can. How are you doing history differently?
I think of Julian Barnes's definition of a net as a series of holes held together by string. And there were these erasures. Yes, Mildred burned her journals. The Nazis destroyed countless documents, including the records of the trial at the Reichskriegsgericht, and yet the final sentencing document survived. The American and British governments also suppressed information, and that didn't surface in the US until the passage of the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. And then this group, which came to be known as the Rote Kapelle, the Red Orchestra, which was named by the Abwehr, German intelligence, not by the group itself. Mildred called her group the Circle. But it was then that, that details of the group began to emerge. Another way that so the evidence, so there are lots of holes, you know, and so I had to look at that and think, do I fill the holes that I can't fill? How would I fill the holes? Or do I just call attention to the holes? And I decided to do the latter, because I think that there's meaning in silence, just as there is in poetry or in a piece of music. And I wanted to honor those silences or those gaps in the archives. I thought, I had these letters that my grandmother gave me when I was 16, as I mentioned, and I realized that what I wanted to do was a much larger, more complex book that described the history of this group, that drew on archival evidence from other countries. So I ended up visiting 27 archives in 4 countries, and because there was an espionage element that also created a lot of gaps, because a lot of the coded messages were either not, they were enciphered, and they either were not, they remained enciphered, or they were destroyed, and so, but there were enough memoirs and primary source documents, letters, enough journals. Mildred destroyed her journals, but other people in the group did not. One of my favorite archival discoveries was at the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand in Berlin, the German Resistance Memorial Center. And I worked with an archivist there, Hans Coppi, whose parents were in Mildred's group. His mother was pregnant, 5 months pregnant, when she got arrested by the Gestapo and imprisoned, along with Mildred and others, and her husband. And she was allowed to give birth to Hans, and then was executed. So Hans grew up, his father was also named Hans Coppi, and I write about him as well. He grew up with this history, and he became a historian of the resistance. And when I introduced myself to him at the archive, there was almost a familial connection. You know, he was so happy to meet me, and still, he was protective of the archive. It's not just like going to a library and checking out a book. I had to really prove myself to him, and I kept showing up, and I had long lists of questions, and I had done a tremendous amount of reading, and after a few days, he looked at me and he said, okay. I'll show you some things. And so one of my favorite things that he showed me was was a note, it's called a Kasseber in Germany, a secret note passed in prison. And it's just extraordinary that there's a word for that in German. But basically, it was somebody had written it in the back of another document, and there was a little bit of information about Mildred in it, and it was written by a prisoner. And these notes were passed back and forth between the prisoners and the families of the prisoners, often through the laundry. They would sew them into the hems of garments. During this time, in the middle of toward the end of the Second World War, the prisons needed to economize, and so they required the families of the incarcerated to do their laundry, which became an excellent way of passing notes back and forth. So this was one of these notes that one of the prisoners in this women's prison who had heard rumors about Mildred and information about Mildred had written down and passed. And that enabled me to fill in a little bit of a hole, which was when Mildred was in solitary confinement for several months. She did not write anything. She was not permitted to write any letters. And so how do I describe that? And I gave myself a few rules, very strict rules, and one was I will not make anything up. I will not make up dialogue. I will not make up interior monologues. This is going to be deeply researched, narrative nonfiction, and so how do I vividly describe her incarceration and describe what she was thinking and feeling if I don't have her writing on it? Well, here was one example, and this woman said, "We hear that she's starting to lose her mind." So she was starting, and this was around the time that she learned that her husband had been executed. So he was executed before she was, but anyway, I think. And then I'll just say one more little bit about that, which is that I tried to take a kind of kaleidoscopic view of her. So I was looking at her from different perspectives, and that's one example from this incarcerated woman. But also through the eyes of a little boy. His name was Don Heath, and I heard his name uttered by my grandmother when she gave me those letters when I was 16. And when I decided that I was ready to write this book, I had 2 other books under my belt, so I felt sufficiently prepared, as prepared as one can be for this kind of, it was a very heavy lift. But I thought, Don Heath. Well, Don Heath was the son of an American diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, Don Heath Sr., who had a kind of clandestine arrangement with Henry Morgenthau, Cordell Hull, and Sumner Welles to obtain intelligence, on-the-ground intelligence from Germans in Berlin. And Arvid Harnack, Mildred's husband, was one of his sources that he wished him to be. And so I explain in the book how he eventually was introduced to Arvid, and it was through Mildred, my great-great-aunt, and then there was an arrangement that was made basically about a month after Germany invaded Poland for little Don Heath, between the ages of 11 and 13, between 1939 and 1941, to serve as Mildred's courier. And so she basically, twice a week, he showed up at her apartment, and she tutored him on English and American literature. And at the end of these lessons, she would slip into his knapsack a piece of paper. On the paper was a location and a time where they could meet outside Berlin, outside Gestapo surveillance, and exchange information. And at this point, Mildred and Arvid and others in the circle were obtaining operational and military strategies, and stealing them and then giving them to the Allies, both the United States and the Soviet Union. So this was the United States angle of this, which was not well known by German historians. They focused on the Soviet Union angle. They were sort of seen as primarily a Soviet spy ring, which was actually inaccurate. They were trying to give information to Hitler's enemies. So, but to go back to Don Heath, when I decided to write this book, I thought, here's another hole. I want to describe Mildred's espionage, and I need somebody who had firsthand knowledge of this, and I probably waited too long to find Don Heath. And I was very frustrated with myself, and then this is a long story, but I'll just cut to the chase. I found him. I tracked him down. He was in California, and he was 89 years old. And I jumped on a plane, and I flew out to meet him. And he opened the door, and he, just like Hans Koppe, the head of one of the archivists at the archivists I described, the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand, Don Heath sort of felt this familial connection with me and remembered Mildred as almost like his aunt. And so, and he had tears in his eyes, and we both basically had tears in our eyes throughout the entire interview, and there were several interviews over the course of several days, at the end of which he said, "Well, Rebecca, now I can die." And I said, "Don, don't do that. I'm going to have some follow-up questions." And then a few months later, he did die. And then I was crushed. I wanted to, because at that point, I realized I needed to make his role a lot larger in the book. It was just going to be a chapter. And then his family got in touch with me and said, "Would you like to come out to California again? We have 12 steamer trunks of documents that you might want to." I said, I'll be right there. And I jumped onto the plane again, flew out there. And I was going through the documents, and Don Heath's wife, Julie, was in the corner with a paper shredder. And she was shredding all this stuff because she was sort of trying to get through stuff. And I was going through, on the other side of the room, trying to go through as quickly as possible to try to find things to rescue.
This is so painful.
I know. Anybody who's done archival research. And I reached into one manila envelope, and I pulled out Don's mother's diaries. And they're just pure gold, because I wanted to corroborate. Of course, I'm interviewing him, but he's telling me about events that happened decades ago, and I thought I would love to have another source, and so I had one, and I actually turned my back. If you're Julie, I sort of did this, and I took out my phone and I just started taking photographs of every page, just in case she snatched it from me and relegated it to the paper shredder. She did not. I convinced her to donate it to the Hoover Institution and the other papers. So these are the ways that I filled in the holes.
I think we just witnessed a TED Talk. I have like a little bit of a, I don't know, contrarian question. I feel like it's become actually kind of a cliche by this point in the year 2025 to draw a parallel to Europe in the 1930s. We all see it now, right? It's not a particularly original observation, and yet, at least the four of us, and I think most of the people in this room, feel really fascinated by that period. I'd love to know what you guys think actually is the use of this history right now, and is there a risk of actually like overemploying this cliche? I'll start with you, Suzanne.
Yeah, I think it ties back to what I was saying earlier, is that, okay, people have done this before, and by, going back to the theme of this panel, by looking at ordinary people, how do ordinary people do that? And aside from being actually instructive in some ways, or at least, we could find those parallels pretty clearly. The other thing that is really interesting to me, and is a question that I've actually been asked in other events, is, how do you get to that point of, and I think this is the whole point of what we're trying to do here today, and I don't have an answer, but I'm really interested in it, of someone who is truly willing to risk everything for change. And, and not just this book, but my previous book, Power Hungry, these are women and men as well who really were like, we will die for a revolution. And, it's more of a question than an answer to today. It's like, when will we get to this point? I don't want anyone to die. I don't want there to be, any sort of guns or bombs. But where will we care that much that we're willing to risk everything for change? And I think that is where the change truly comes from.
Yeah. about you, Peter? We talked about this a little bit with Sefton Delmer in specific and sort of his insights into propaganda, but what about just generally like the fact that we are talking about that time so much?
Yeah, and Delmer actually saw the principles of propaganda play out in democratic countries and in the Soviet Union. So, and I stress that in the book. I don't think these comparisons with the Nazis are always that useful. I've only been in America quite recently, like 3 years now, and I spend most of my time in Europe anyway. I think it's very ambitious when Americans compare what's going on here with Europe in the 30s. I'm fascinated by the American history of these things. I'm fascinated by Huey Long in Louisiana, who I think is a much more closer parallel to Trump than Hitler. I don't think you guys need to look to Europe in the 30s. I think it's like here, you know. Do you want to say something about Huey Long, governor of Louisiana, big populist? Yeah, I mean, and he was known as the first dictator born by American soil. I mean, he's the prototype for all the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. So, which is a novel, by the way, from Eastern Europe, the way I am. Ignore the accent; it's a facade. But it's a sort of novel that you would get about Eastern Europe in the 70s, and down to kind of like the main narrator of all the King's Men is this conformist who doesn't really know who he is, who has this kind of like desire for a father figure. I mean, it's so similar to what Czesław Miłosz writes about Eastern Europe. So these things echo, but you have your own very rich tradition of autocracy, which you can examine. You don't have to start just looking for like, Sophie Scholl, even though, there's wonderful parallels too. So I do think one has to be careful, but also look, I do think every generation has an era they look back to, and it's not just an American thing. I mean, throughout definitely the Western imagination, you do go back to the 1930s, and it's very interesting reading the founding daddies, the people who made America, and they were obsessed with Rome. I mean, they're worried about Caesar appearing and taking over the country, so they're using Rome as their way to analyze, and now you have Elon Musk, who keeps on saying he's like Sulla, who's the first Roman dictator-ish kind of character before Caesar, and so there's lots of, so Americans either want Nazis or Rome, and I'm like, Louisiana, just look at Louisiana.
I just want to say, in Louisiana, I went to New Orleans a couple of years ago for a work trip. I stayed at the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans, and right in the lobby, right by check-in, there is a little brass box that is Huey Long's bribe box, and described as such, and you can go see it, and it has a little plaque underneath, and this is like literally like where he took money to pass legislation. So there's incredible monuments to American history all over. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, or maybe about the Scholl siblings, since that's what you're working on now.
Well, I would like to address this question because I think it is it's a salient question, and I think it's so important to address. No, we are not living in Nazi Germany. No, there is not a direct parallel between Trump and Hitler. However, I think it is instructive to see how there can be resonances, and how what's happening right now can indicate what may be on the horizon. And so I feel very strongly that when I started to see what happened with Roe v. Wade, I could not help thinking about what happened in Nazi Germany, which is that really the control of women's reproductive rights is a bellwether of a more expansive assault on democracy. And immediately after Hitler became chancellor, 19,000 women lost their jobs in government positions, in both regional and local government offices. There was a quota that was imposed on universities that could only admit a certain percentage of women. The number of women attending universities before Hitler became chancellor was 18,000 across Germany, and that number dwindled to 5,447 within several years. So there was and then there were lots of, the Nazi government incentivized women to return to traditional roles. It did constitute, in my view, a backlash to the gains that women had made throughout the Weimar era, particularly in the late 20s in employment and education, and it was trying to bring women back to these sort of more traditional roles, and this as an example of something that occurs in the current news that is a direct echo of something that happened in after Hitler became chancellor is this the proposed medal for mothers if they have 6 or more children. It is a direct parallel to what the policy was that was instituted in Nazi Germany. Women who had 6 or more children were given the cross of the mother cross, basically. And Trump's administration proposed the exact same medal for the exact same number of children. I don't think that's accidental. So I do think that there is, all right, what are the resonances? What are the echoes? There is an effort to try to get women to assume more traditional roles, to highlight them as, the bearers, people who bear children for the country. And there's a lot more I could say about this. And again, it's a loose parallel. I'm not trying to say that this is a Nazi policy, but there are resonances, and I think and the same there's a financial incentive that's being proposed now. Women get, what is it, $5,000 or something? Does anybody remember? Anyway, a few thousand. Pardon? 5,000. Right. Okay. Good. I'm sorry. And so, there was a financial incentive as well in Nazi Germany that was offered to couples who married. The woman had to marry somebody and then quit her job, and then get pregnant and have a child, and then the marriage loan that they received was forgiven. 25% of it was forgiven after the first child, 50% after the second child, 75% after the third, and after the fourth child, they didn't have to pay back the loan. So you could see that this desire to incentivize, and it has there's a lot that the pronatalism, there's a sort of an element of that that I won't go into. But I'm just focusing on this issue in particular, and you could there are others I could speak of which I don't have time for. But I think I do want to make one other point, which is Sophie Scholl, you mentioned. And so my next book is about Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Resistance. It's a group of students at the University of Munich who decided to fight Hitler and who decided to risk and lose their lives. Almost all of them lost their lives as well. Sophie Scholl was executed by guillotine 6 days after my great-great-aunt was. And so it felt like the natural kind of next step for me to write about Sophie Scholl. But they wrote leaflets. They produced leaflets, just like Mildred and Arvid and their group. But they produced them during the war, when producing a leaflet that criticized Hitler would come with a death sentence. So think about the risk that one must take to just produce a piece of paper that informs Germans, this is what's going on and this is how we have to fight back. And I think if I were to say, the question of what would we do, how do we resist and so forth, I think information is the place to start. And again, to highlight the fact that this is not Nazi Germany yet, we still can't, we have some, if you do a Substack and you criticize Trump, it doesn't come with you're not arrested by the Gestapo and executed. But I think that this is where we need to start. It's where Mildred and Arvid started, trying to produce leaflets to try to inform the German public about what was going on. It's what Sophie Scholl and her group did. And I just want to very, very, very quickly read to you an example of just a couple sentences from one of these leaflets that these students in Germany produced. They produced 6 leaflets between June 1942 and February 1943. And here is leaflet number 2. Why do Germans behave so apathetically in the face of the most atrocious, most inhumane crimes? Germans return to their dull, stupid sleep. No one can exonerate themselves. Everyone is guilty, guilty, guilty. There's a lot of passion there. Another leaflet informs Germans what to do. Sabotage arms factories, sabotage meetings, rallies, festivals, organizations, everything that the Nazi Party brought into being, blah, blah, blah. The fourth leaflet, every word that comes out of Hitler's mouth is a lie. When he says peace, he means war. We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The white rose will never leave you in peace. I get chills every time I read those leaflets, and I think they show us the passion that these German students had. At the bottom of these leaflets, they said copy and distribute widely. So it started out with 10 copies, then 100, then 1,000, then 10,000, then 20,000, and so forth, and spread to other university towns. So not just in Munich, but also just really across Germany. And again, it comes down to the spread of information, and so I think if there's a lesson to be learned, that we should not silence ourselves. We should articulate our views about what's going on, and as Mildred said in her letter to her mother in 1931, just a couple years before Hitler became chancellor, she wrote to her mother in Milwaukee, and she said, so many Germans are hiding their heads in the sand. And so I think we need to keep our eyes open, and we need to keep our mouths open as well.
We're at time. I want everybody here to buy all the books, and I want you to have the chance to talk to all three of these amazing panelists. Let's have a round of applause for Rebecca, Suzanne, and Peter.